It only took me 6 sessions to remember to start the recording. All right. Okay, I'll get started in just a minute. All right, and you can also see my screen share. Yes, okay, which apparently I've been clicking through that I didn't realize. No. Okay, here we go. All right, so we're going to get started. The lovely Stephanie is on a well-deserved vacation this week, so we will not be blessed with her knowledge and stories and presence tonight. But that's okay, because most of what you're getting tonight is a recap. So I asked a favor of Alma. She's going to interrupt me if you need to put something in the chat, but I would also welcome you to please just unmute yourself and interrupt me, because it's very difficult to watch all the screens, because I do also have to make sure there's no participants stuck outside of the meeting. So we are going to get started. Welcome. This is session 6. Everyone pause and give yourself a round of applause. Some pats on the back. Nice job. We made it. Thank you for giving up your summer evenings. Here we are, session 6. Next steps, recap, more on the funds, a variety of things. I was not able to coordinate schedules with Stephanie before she left on her trip. So you can expect an email from me with a link or some sort of way to sign up for the one-on-one sessions, probably after the 4th of July holiday. So we are still very much offering those as follow-up to everyone, and we will be anchoring those conversations in your homework assignments. I will say that if for some reason you do not have a completed homework assignment, or maybe you have 1 or 2 of the assignments but didn't do all of them, that's fine. When you sign up for your one-on-one, let me let someone in quickly. When you sign up for your one-on-one, if for some reason you do not have a completed assignment as guide, feel free to send us a note saying why and how you think we can be helpful to you at this phase in your development. So I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly tonight. We have a lot to recap and a little bit from last time that I wanted to recap at the beginning, because I felt we rushed through some parts of the finance discussion last time. So again, just me tonight. I'm watching the waiting room just in case anyone ends up in there. So please unmute yourself and interrupt. If you can't, put it in the chat and Alma will raise it verbally with me. Thank you, Alma. Okay, so last session. So as I stated, we're going to go through, recap some of what we've learned. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a very clear idea of what your next step needs to be to move your project forward. Okay, so these are the terms that we presented last week. I just wanted to recap that for our continued discussion. So when you're talking about financing your project, you have debt and equity. Those are the 2 key resources you're seeking to build your pro forma or your capital stack. And those words are used fairly interchangeably. Your development budget is kind of like all of the costs, soft costs and hard costs. So soft costs are things like paying an attorney or paying a historic consultant, an architect. And hard costs are things like lumber, which is a harder cost than normal these days. An operating subsidy may help you underwrite your project. So it may help you get through the financials and get your pro forma to where it needs to be. It will help you support your development while you're operating it, which is different than a grant or something going into your sources. So a subsidy for operating goes into that operating budget. A project grant or subsidy will be a source for the project. So that's a distinction. Sorry, a capital subsidy is what I was just describing. So two different kinds of subsidies going in two different sections of your pro forma, one going into where you're operating and the other going into your sources and uses. So here are the key details in your pro forma: income, rents for your units and fees, maybe that operating subsidy, your expenses, which include your debt service, utilities, management fees, and then your costs for the project. So these are your development costs and your sources. So the costs can also be described as uses. Sometimes you hear people say, what are your sources and uses? So the sources are where you're getting your debt and equity from, and the costs are how are you going to use that debt and equity to build your project. Again, this is all just recap from last week quickly. So you remember this graphic. So with that context and that vocabulary, this might make a little bit more sense to you looking at it now than the first time we put it up on the screen. So, here's the key differences between doing an affordable project or a deeply affordable project with supportive services versus market rate housing. And here are the sources outlined in the same format. So, we asked the question, if you were a private developer, how would you pay for this? So another way to say that is, how would you underwrite it? So underwriting is what, your funders, your lenders, your construction lenders are going to be doing to make sure that your project works. So if you were a private sector developer, you'd be over here in this very gray, boring side of the graphic. Just kidding. No offense to our private sector partners. But, this is a traditional way you would underwrite a project, right? You have fees, you have rent, essentially. And when you start looking at affordable housing, that's where you have to layer in these subsidies to your sources or your capital stack, if you will. And this is a nice illustration in stack form to help you remember that. So again, we skimmed over this example last week. So this is a sources and uses summary. So this is an outline of those sources where you're going to get money to pay for your project, and the uses of what you're going to use that money to do. So there's some blue bubbles I'll pull up for us here. So here's a total of, a certain amount of the sources where they're highlighting how they're calculating the gap, right? So this is the total project cost minus these are their permanent sources. So tax credit, equity, and a bank loan. I'm just going to pause for a second to let some people in. Sorry about that. So this is the gap that they're calculating, and don't let a gap scare you in your project. In Western New York, whether it's affordable housing or not, we're typically going to have gaps in our project, and that's where we just get creative with our sources on how to address the gaps. So if you probably will be working with a consultant or a partner to develop a summary like this, most likely in Excel, that will outline your project costs and how you're paying for it. Okay, so again, why are there so many different lenders? Basically, it's because everybody is doing a bridge loan in an affordable project. There's just so many gaps to cover. And each lender, as Stephanie has said, each lender or each source typically has strings attached, right? So remember Stephanie saying, you can't raise the rent for a period of 5 years, or you can't, you have to keep the certain percentage of the units affordable for a certain time frame. Those are all different pieces of the puzzle. So as you're addressing your project, you want to be able to kind of massage those and change things while still meeting your objectives and your organization's mission to be able to finance. And it's kind of this like circular process. And so in a second, I'm going to show you that graphic where it looks linear, right, from concept to development. But now, having gone through this course, it's not linear. And each step, you're kind of informing the last as you go. We good? Any questions? Okay. So this is basically what I was just saying. You want to make sure that you can be clear on your essentials. And that's why we spent so much time at the beginning of this course kind of outlining the why. Because as long as you and your leadership team is clear on the why you're doing something, the sources and the financing can typically be addressed to achieve those goals through various different paths forward. So as long as you're true to your why, your project may change 75 times before you close on financing. I mean, I know some of you on this course know that, but I have reviewed pro formas that have been saved that are version 92, right? So you may end up changing your project that many times before you close on financing, but that is not abnormal for development in general, not just affordable housing development. So a couple of questions came up last week on some other common sources you see in our market, and I just wanted to highlight them on this slide so that you can go back as a reference if you ever come across them. So just quickly, and some of these are far more complex than the 2 sentences I put on the slide. But you may encounter these if you're doing a development project in Western New York, especially a large scale development project. So if you have done your 4 or 8 unit or 12 unit project and you're deciding to do the next thing, you're probably going to be encountering these sources. So we have the brownfield tax credit. So this is a refundable credit, which means you don't get it until you have certified that you have cleaned the property. And even then you don't get it for a while because it's New York State and it's a refundable credit. So it takes some time. So you have to make sure when you're building your team, if you think that you're going to be buying a property that has contamination, which is a lot of commercially used properties in Western New York. I think in the city, I've heard environmental attorneys say, you can pretty much find any property in Buffalo that's been commercially used and it'll be dirty. And I'm sure this similar things stand for the Rochester area. So I'm not saying that to scare you to say your property is dirty. I'm just saying if you do come across a property, maybe it's in the heart of your community and you're set on redeveloping it for good reason, this tax credit, this program, actually, it's a program that the DEC runs, is available to you. And it allows you to address the liability, related to dirty sites. It is going to increase your soft costs, your attorney costs. You're going to need a special brownfield environmental firm. And I will share with you, because I've come across this working with different clients. If you have a property and you've already done your phase 1, your first environmental review, and it comes back and says, yeah, there was a dry cleaner here. This property is probably going to be dirty. If your phase 1 says that to you, that's when you're going to want to stop and really research what attorney you're using and what environmental consultant you're using. So that's the critical moment. If your phase 1 comes back and says this property is clean, no further investigation is needed, great. That's all the lender is going to require for you to move forward. But if it does come back and say it's probably dirty, before you do your phase 2 to determine how dirty it is, before you let someone come on site with a drill and take samples, you want to consult an attorney and a consultant who has experience with brownfield. And I will tell you why. So once you get into the program, but once you're allowed into the program by the DEC, after you've documented that your site is dirty, which does require a phase 2, any additional investigation is going to be eligible for the program. So if you get a consultant to do a phase 2 and you want to really know what's wrong with your property, it might cost $75,000 to do your phase 2. It's a lot of money, right? If you get a consultant who will work with you and work with your attorney and advise you, they can reduce the scope of that phase 2 to maybe $10,000, get you in the program. Yes, Alma?
Oh, I thought Esther had her hand up. Esther, did you have a question?
I can't see the chat.
No, it just keeps going up for some reason. Esther's
celebrating that she's almost done with the class.
Thank you.
Thank you for interrupting. You can still see my screen, right? Okay, because I moved things.
Yes.
So anyway, if you have the right consultant on your team and the right attorney, they will advise you to spend less money before you get into the program, because once you're in the program, then you can get your tax credits. And this is important because it's a step you may want to take before you seek a joint venture partner. So again, after your phase 1 comes back, if you think your property is dirty, like if you're like, yeah, it's dirty, then you're going to want to address the getting into the program before you spend too much money investigating that.
Maggie, we have a question from Ayet. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. They want to know if mushrooms can be used to remediate brownfields.
I am not the right person to ask that question of. I've read about it. I think it's cool. But that is something that you're going to want to address with your attorney, your consultant, and ultimately the New York State DEC. Because the answer to that probably is it depends on what you're doing with it. Any other questions about brownfield before we move on? It's a pretty common source you see in capital stacks for projects of a larger scale. So I just wanted to make sure we covered it. Okay, so a couple other sources you'll want to know about. And is Christiana on? You can definitely interrupt me during this one because she's the tax credit expert.
I'm here.
Hi, Christiana. But so historic tax credits are a little different. So unlike the brownfield credit, which is refundable, historic tax credits, you'll hear the word syndicated. So that means that they're sold on a secondary market. So when you go to close your financing, if you're doing a historic tax credit project, your tax credit investor is buying your credits. So unlike the brownfield where it's refundable and you're asking a lender, traditional lender, to bridge the time that it takes for that to come in as a refundable credit, the historic tax credits are structured differently. They're syndicated.
You don't need to always syndicate those. Sorry, this is Christiana. Smaller projects, you can just use the credit like a homeowner would use that credit and just apply it to your liability at the end of the year when you close out that project. The syndication is definitely way more used by those huge projects, the multi-million-dollar rehabs, because they need that money up front to be able to actually pay for the project. So that's why they'll syndicate it. But for smaller projects, I think are more aligned with what might happen out of this class and the people here, you don't have to syndicate it. And I can't even explain to you the syndication process. I've had Steve Weiss explain it to me like 3 times and I still don't understand it anyway. So
Same. And that's a good point, Christiana. I would also caution, though, if you do have a smaller project and you're trying to use tax credits, you do need to follow all the same process that you would for a large project. So you want to make sure you call Christiana at Preservation Buffalo Niagara, or also make sure you have a consultant and an attorney and a architect who's familiar with the historic tax credit process. And my secondary caution, and Christiana, I think that this is something I should follow up with you on to get some more information. But if you are a housing developer, I think there's some challenges with taking the credit.
yeah, the challenges come, I mean, there might be on the financial side, I can't speak to that, but on like the actual content of the project, there are definitely going to be moments where your requirements by HUD or what other funding you might be having of what they require the units to be sized and things like that might not always immediately align with what SHPO, what the State Historic Preservation Office approves and allows you to do. But there have been many examples of affordable housing using those tax credits. So it really depends on like what that base of that building is that you're starting with. If there is the ability to kind of gut rehab it and turn it into exactly what you want, or if there are character defining features on the interior that to use the tax credits we have to retain. There's a lot of interesting kind of dancing that goes between SHPO, the National Park Service, and HUD or whoever else is that affordable housing person. So it definitely can be a little bit challenging depending on the building you're talking about. But it really depends on like what the condition and everything of that original building is. But no, you're right. There's definitely moments where they'll require this much square footage or this kind of access and your building just doesn't have that and you just don't know how to do that otherwise.
We're lucky we have Christiana on with us. So that, that's certainly an area of special expertise you're going to want to seek out. And also an attorney and an accountant. Those are key partners for any of these tax credit deals. And also I would just say again, with the taking the tax credit, you have to have a liability. So you can't take a credit. It's not refundable, right? It's not you're not going to get a refund for it, if that makes sense. You have to be able to use it. So, okay. New market tax credit. So if we stacked these, as like most complicated or least complicated to most. I think that's the order we're going in. So I mentioned these last week. Mark asked a question about them, so I just wanted to recap. This is a funding mechanism to incentivize investors to invest in markets they typically wouldn't. And it is competitive. You have to work with a community development or a CDE, community development entity, I think is what it stands for. If you are seeking a new market tax credit, you absolutely need to find a specialist. And they are fairly competitive, and they try at the federal level, they try to kind of share the wealth, and therefore you'll only see one of these projects funded in a certain geography every couple years. And I would say that geography is kind of generally just like Western New York. So, you know, it's certainly something to look into, especially if you have a really large project that involves more than housing. So that's the other thing I'll say that I should have put on the slide. This is not for housing. It's for business or commercial, maybe grocery, amenities, but it's typically fairly large scale, like many millions of dollars. So it's for big projects that aren't housing. Other sources that you should consider that hopefully, you know, your team has someone on there that kind of can help you research and access. Empire State Development often has sources. They run the New York State Consolidated Funding application, which has some grant money for private and nonprofit developers. Utility companies often have a variety of different funding opportunities. And that really depends on who your utility company is. And my advice for that is if you have a project, and sometimes they don't finance housing, but sometimes they do. So I would just look and see if your utility company has like a community liaison, or sometimes they have a municipal liaison. You could ask your city hall, and then they'll just tell you what grant money they might have for you. And, you know, private foundations are always an option to fill a gap in a capital stack as well. So if you have a project that's like the best thing ever and you're a nonprofit that's serving your community, and everything else is working, you have your tax credits or you have your funding sources lined up, but you still have an $800,000 gap, that's the perfect time to go talk to a foundation and say, this is done, we just need $800,000, because they love to be the last one in, I would say. Okay, so I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. It's kind of a recap of the whole overall development process, illustrated by the lending and financing cycles that we just talked about. And I will just share, if anyone's curious, Nationally Risk Housing is sponsored by a variety of different entities. One of them is State Farm, and they sponsored this particular presentation. So if you're wondering why there's a State Farm logo on there, that's why. But okay, so here's the physical development process. And this is where I was saying it's linear, but really now that you've taken this course, you know, nothing is linear in real estate, and you're always going to be reiterating and changing your project as you go. So here's your concept, you know, here's your idea, your pre-development, which is it real? Can I do it? Then your construction, your closing on your construction, your leasing to your tenants, and then you are managing the property for a certain period of time. The recapitalization is when you might refinance or sell, and that's important to know at the beginning, or that's important to know at, you know, during your process, because sometimes your loans or your grants, you're going to have to answer the question of how do I get paid back? And so sometimes that answer is through refinance down the road. So that's something you're going to want to think about, even if you're never planning on reselling or selling, excuse me, you might need to plan on recapitalizing at some point. Or as Stephanie shared with us, you might do a project and then refinance it to have pre-development money for your next project. So it's always something to think about in the bigger picture. So to recap the concept phase, without giving yourself too much brain damage, you kind of want to go through the motions of understanding, like soup to nuts, what this is going to look like, so that when you start reiterating different pieces of the process, you can go back and know where's your line in the sand, what are you not going to give up, and what are you flexible with changing, because change is inevitable in this process, as I think we've discovered. So here's an example of how the funds are spent. And again, this is a large scale example. Your project may not be this big, but I think the phasing still applies whether your project is large or small. So you're going to have your funds that you have to expend during pre-development, your funds that you have to expend during construction, and the commitments and the time frame tied to your sources, right? So that's what this is illustrating. That's why it's going out 15 or 30 years, because you're not just magically having $40 million come in year one, right? It's a longer term vision and commitment. So this is illustrating a sample project in North Carolina, and to achieve 60% AMI in this market, the income would have to be less than $42,000 per year. So this is just some details for the illustration we're going to walk through. So in order to serve families with income less than 60% AMI, which who can remember what AMI means? Pop quiz. Did anyone put it in the chat? Area medium income. Yay, I got. Okay, so in order to serve families with lower than 60% AMI, then the rents drop, right? So when the rents drop in your model, now you have a gap. So here's your $6 million gap. So one of the sources that Stephanie mentioned that's available, and this is more for like large scale projects, but not always, I guess, is the Housing Trust Fund. So here's one source that this group has identified to fill the gap. And here it is illustrated in their capital stack, which this is becoming over here. Okay, so the pre-development phase can be pretty pricey, right? Some of you are in that phase right now. Depending on the scale of your project, it can be a lot of money, because you're looking at typically, and in our market, this slide says 5 to 20%. In our market, I would say it's probably going to be closer to 15 to 20%. It can be a large chunk of your project budget before you're even able to close on financing. So that's something to be aware of. Construction, obviously you're building the thing. So this is the biggest chunk of your expended funds. And so by this phase, you have closed on financing, you're monitoring construction, you're making sure you have the right team on board to represent you during that process, and you're moving towards permanent financing. So this is the closeout of your construction. This is when you have your tenants in place and your property has started to earn income, whether subsidized or not. and you have your permanent financing coming in. So sometimes that is a permanent loan that's being paid over time, or sometimes it looks like you're closing out construction costs with different sources. And you typically have, your management partner on board at this phase. And then recapitalization, which we just talked about. Okay, now we're going to do a little review. Who's ready? Organizational readiness. So when you begin as the sponsor or developer, right, because you're all developers now, these are the important pieces that you're going to want to identify. And then for this series of slides, we have on the bottom a threshold. So I want you to go back and refer to this if you need to know whether or not you're achieving success. I think sometimes with real estate development, it can feel like, 2 steps forward, 1,000 steps back. I'm sure many of you can relate. So these thresholds are good indicators of whether or not you have achieved success in this phase of your project, right? So as you set up your legal structure and develop your mission for your project specifically and who you're serving, these are your thresholds. Can you check the box that it fits your mission? If you can, then you've achieved success. Can you check the box that you're legally constituted entity? Check the box. You've achieved success. And that's how you're going to be moving your project out of this very first step here. Same thing, your goal and your vision. So being very clear on, like we talked about, what is set in stone, what cannot change, what will make your project successful, versus where can you be flexible? Where can you find that flexibility as you're pursuing different sources that have different strings attached? Where can you be flexible as you respond to the community, as you respond to your board members sometimes? Where is there flexibility and where is there not? And that has to be really clear in this process. So again, can you check the box? Does it fit your organization's mission? If yes, then you've achieved success. And have the decision makers successfully participated in this project as well. Another threshold for success. Your organizational readiness, right? This is where it can be begin to get kind of painful, where you have to start to do the accounting and bookkeeping and, get all the tax documents together. And this is about capacity, right? This is the moment where you decide, can we achieve this with the capacity we have? Do we need help? And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like in a second. Or do we need to do some more capacity work before we take on a project like this? So, there's moments here where you can decide if you are successful. Also, I think, skip too fast. What's important to note on this slide is that they have a designated person that's ready to begin this process. And I think in this class, that's some of you, right? You are the designated person selected to go out and get this project started or get it done. And so, that's an important part of the process as well. Okay, I think everyone's done popping in and out of the meeting, so I actually do have the chat up now. So thank you, Alma. Okay, site control. So in my 9 years of real estate now, I always, always, always ask my client, do you have site control? Do you have site control? Do you have site control? It is the most important, in my opinion, piece of the project, because if you do not have control, then you do not have equity. You do not have a decision making ability. You cannot secure financing. You cannot secure grant dollars. So I always say site control, a more exciting and fun way to remember it is own the dirt. So if you own the dirt, you're good, right? You control it, and you don't have to actually own it, but you need some sort of documentation, a long-term lease, development rights, that's giving you control of this property. Then the second piece of this is, can you build what you want to build on that property? Do you need zoning changes? Because that's going to inform your next steps of how you're pursuing the project, right? So you want to make sure you know those two things and that they're clear to you. All right, your plan. So, you know, you've already put your team together now. You've got your site. How can you start researching and informing, you know, that your plan fits and it fits your organization's goals, it fits your development goals. And at this point, you know, you probably need to start thinking about who your advisors and partners are going to be. And if an advisor could be a paid person, it could be someone working towards a fee. And when I say someone working towards a fee, what I mean is there are some very talented advisors in our community that take projects from start to finish. They'll manage your LIHTC process. They will manage, you know, and this is, again, this is my perspective. Don't forget, just from this larger projects, the same applies to smaller projects too. You're probably just looking for a different kind of advisor. So you still want someone with development experience. Your advisor is probably just going to fill a different role that's going to be slightly less focused on financing and tax credits and more on the development process and accessing funds to do smaller scale developments outside of tax credits. So this applies in all scenarios though. So, you know, one of the main reasons you want to work with an advisor, whether your project is large or small, is that they're going to help you cross that finish line. And funders and lenders are looking for that person. If this is your first development project, the first question a lender is going to ask is who's on their team, right? Who is on your team that knows what they're doing, that's done this before? And this question I can be infuriating to people that have like done a lot of the work themselves and maybe almost closed on a different project but didn't. But you know, it's the ecosystem that our lending ecosystem that we function in, and we have to make sure that, you know, we're empowering you to pick those partners so that you are achieving success. So if anyone wants any documentation, we have some RFQs, RFIs we can help you put out there. We have a list of different advisors that our partners and, you know, other organizations have worked with. I know Stephanie has a list of consultants that she has worked with. And we can address this certainly in everyone's one-on-one, but it is a really important next step. And I actually think I have another slide on it, so I don't want to talk too much about it right now. Yes, here it is. Okay, so, you know, we talked about the team, and, you know, this question, this is kind of a recap. So feel free to throw ideas in the chat in response to these questions. So, you know, why are there so many people on your development team? Anyone want to chime in other than Lucy?
It's complicated.
It's complicated, yes. You need a lot of different experts. Yes, Christiana put in the chat. Spread the risk and provide experience. Yeah, that's a good point, Mark. So, you know, when I'm talking about what is a lender going to ask, well, the lender's trying to mitigate their risk. So they're going to want experienced people on board. But sometimes experienced people are willing to help, you know, community development entities get started. And a lot of times people are motivated certainly by money, but sometimes, you know, they want to give back to their community. And, you know, hopefully we can help you identify those partners. I was on a call today with a group in Syracuse doing a project, and the developer has done a lot of projects. She's done a lot of development down in DC. She's an older white woman, and she's had a lot of success. And she is partnering with 2 Black business entrepreneurs that want to learn how to do a project and do it in Syracuse where their businesses are. So there are people out there that will help you. You just have to make sure you know where to look and also to properly vet them, because you don't want too much help from people that aren't actually going to be helpful. Anything else? I think that pretty much covers that question. So here's some different team members, different titles of team members I want to run through quickly. So there's advisor, development consultant, developer partner. We talked a little bit about joint ventures, so that's where the developer partner comes into play. So who are they and how are each of these entities helpful? So they're providing expertise. Sometimes they're providing experience. Sometimes they're providing financial guarantees. So an advisor may also just be a community group, maybe geographically proximate to yours, that has been successful. So I know one pastor in Buffalo that's reached out to a different pastor in Buffalo to help him get started on his congregation's real estate journey. So it could be an informal advisor that's not being paid, or it could be a development consultant. Questions? Oh, Teresa, I thought you had a question. Excuse me. So a development consultant is working with you. They are typically working with you towards getting some sort of financing, right? So sometimes, but not always, they aren't getting paid until your project gets financed. Other times you are paying them from the beginning to help you with pre-development for one reason or another. And then a development partner is, instead of, or sometimes in addition to, hiring a development consultant or getting an advisor, you may determine that you also need a development partner. And so actually, I think an example of where this might happen is if you've got your LIHTC stuff down and you're ready for your tax credit, you have your financing, your development consultant has set you up successfully, but you have a brownfield and your lender is uncomfortable lending to you because you've never done a brownfield remediation. Well, in that case, you may need to seek a co-developer or a joint venture with an entity that has done brownfield projects. And that's just one example. It could be a scale issue. Maybe you need a development partner to come in and provide some more equity if you're doing a really large project. Or maybe your group has decided, hey, here's our vision. We want to put out an RFP for a partner that's going to handle this vision and implement this vision for us. So there's a lot of different reasons why you might pursue a joint venture. And again, whether you're seeking an advisor, a consultant, or a JV partner, please, feel free to reach out. We do have RFQs, RFPs, examples from other cities and other consultants that we can provide to you to successfully achieve those goals. Mark asked a question for the co-development development partner. How can you determine if contractual terms are favorable when you don't know what you don't know? Yes, that's very challenging. This course was in part funded by the Attorney General's office, I believe, to address this issue, right? So knowledge is power. Hopefully through understanding the real estate process and also tapping into other resources, whether it's an advisor or an attorney or sometimes an architect. If you have a strong team, both informal and formal around you, you can manage that process to have favorable outcomes. I have a separate presentation on doing a successful joint venture that I can certainly share. And yes, Alma's adding, you want to have a good attorney, right? You don't just want to put an RFP out there and have Bob, the real estate attorney who does residential closings, handling your RFP, right? You want to find an attorney who has significant experience negotiating large contracts that involve real estate, not just house closings. So you have to be careful that you're properly vetting your team and your advisors to be able to help you make that decision. And I think also that's just a good point that Mark raised in real estate development. There's always unknown unknowns. So you have to try and mitigate that as best as you can and use the resources around you to know that those are going to pop up. So that actually kind of covers the third question on this slide. So, we've talked about how important it is to have your goals refined and certain knowledge of what you can and cannot do on your site, an idea of how you might finance and manage your project. As you understand all of those details of your project, you're going to have a better conversation with a development partner or a development consultant, and you're going to be able to advocate for your project better. So it takes a little bit of work up front to get your team up to speed. And sometimes it takes some funds expended to do that as well. But it's worth it, before identifying a joint venture partner or another partner. Okay, community engagement review. Just kidding. No, I really think that the session on community engagement may be the most important part of this puzzle. And I will say that because nobody is going to care about community engagement as much as the project sponsor. Nobody you pay, nobody you add to the team, not your lender, not your property management company. At the end of the day, the project sponsor is in charge of community engagement because it's your community, it's your neighborhood, right? So that session that Stephanie gave us is gold. And I highly encourage you not only to go back and rewatch it, but ideally to have your entire leadership and decision-making team watch it, because I think it is probably the most overlooked piece of the development process, but it is also the most important. All right. So we have another survey for you and a survey on the overall course that I'll be sending out via email. So we really appreciate your feedback. We're trying to refine this. If you feel there's a gaping hole or massive question you still have, we want to know what it is. You can't offend me, so please be brutally honest, because we want to improve this course for the next cohort, and ideally design a workshop or a 201 course that we can give in the fall that can be even more information. Yes, Alma, I will send the upload link for the box file for the final assignment. And I already shared at the beginning, but in case you came on late, before Stephanie went on her vacation, I did not have a chance to coordinate scheduling for the one-on-ones. So you can also expect an email from me with a link or another way to sign up for those one-on-ones. And if for some reason you struggled with the assignments or you were only able to complete a few, please still schedule the one-on-one and just send us a note, maybe on why you had a challenge with the assignments and what you would like to achieve after the one-on-one session. And we have plenty of time for questions and time to revisit any of those slides with numbers on them if anybody wants me to go back. But I'll open it up to questions, and if I'll actually stop recording too, because if anybody wants to ask specific questions about their projects without it going on YouTube,